Hello, my name is Rhetta Bates. I'm a foreign correspondent who travels the world looking for ways that our international community can solve humanitarian crises and solve conflicts in all ways. On this episode of 6 Minutes, we will be looking at one of the world's most troubled countries. Riddled with political unrest and lack of infrastructure, Libya can be regarded as one of the most failed states of our time. Today, we'll be talking about many different ways in which the conflict has gotten to where it is today and how we can look to rectify the situation. We will also be hearing from a world-renowned political science professor, Professor Hala, and get a little bit of her input on what the conflict can look like and how it can be resolved. Now, before we can look to solve any conflict, I think it is important to really see where it comes from. Now, it is very clear that Gaddafi was probably one of our generation's strongest dictators. The Arab Spring opened up a way for the people to really revolt against this regime. Being that he was assassinated during this time, it truly seemed like a liberating moment, in some ways a victory. It was also very clear that foreign aid was in strong supply. The United States took no time in showing their full support for taking down the Gaddafi regime. Given President Obama at the time was hesitant to use some unconventional tactics, he decided that it would be the best decision to proceed. However, after Gaddafi had fallen, it left Libya in shambles, and there truly was no way to fill the political vacuum besides with rebel groups and smaller minority groups who eventually began to fight. In a strange sense, they were almost united trying to fight against Gaddafi, and now that they didn't have that, there was really nothing left to fight but each other. With all that being said, it is no surprise that today Libya is truly a place where there cannot be any political stability found. Now let's start answering some of the real hard-hitting questions that I'm sure you are very curious to know. I don't want to waste any time in introducing our Professor Hala, but unfortunately she could not be with us today. But she was kind enough to write in some answers to some questions I posed to her that I'm sure the viewers would like to know. First one being, what do you think is the main source of instability in Libya today? For her first response, I really couldn't agree more. I think that the actual lack of infrastructure put in directly following the post-Gaddafi regime is exactly why we see Libya in the state it is today. I think that if there would have been a little more planning going into the aftermath of the fall of the regime, then maybe there'd be a little more hope for the future. This does not, of course, mean it's impossible, as we see neighbors of Libya, like Tunisia, who thrived from the Arab Spring, doing things quite well, or at least progressing in the best ways they know how. Second question. Do you think in this post-Gaddafi world that Libya is less structured or more structured? The answer she gave for this question specifically intrigued me, because it's almost kind of shocking. It's shocking because a fall of a regime that's been implemented for over 4 decades can still have such heavy weight within how people feel that they need to dictate themselves after the fall. But I suppose that's to be expected. If you've been ruled a certain way for over 40 years, it is not surprising that you'll take some of the traits left by your forefathers and use them in what you think is supposed to be meant to move on. Third, in what ways, if any, should the international community or individual state actors feel responsible for the state that we see Libya in today? I'm going to get into more specifics about this specific question later, but I couldn't agree more. Multilateral cooperation should always be the first means of action in any type of international security problem. I think that for any state to thrive and truly build, you need to take from many parts of the globe. Many institutions, many political systems, many cultural contexts. I think it's just necessary and will truly yield the best results. Question 4. Who do you think has the greatest potential of filling the power vacuum we see in Libya? This is a question I will also be dissecting a little later, but I do think she has a point. I think the domestic groups lack the infrastructure and even leadership to carry out a true filling of the political vacuum that we see in Libya. But, and chew on this until we get to a later time in the program, I do think that the international actors are who we really should be thinking about, whether it be Russia, potentially China, or maybe even the United States again. We need to think about larger scale actors filling this vacuum and not just the domestic ones we see within the state. Now the last and possibly the most important question, 5. What can the international community or individual state actors be doing to help rebuild this failed state? And in regards to how she answered this final question, I couldn't agree more. I think that state solidarity is truly the beginning of a foundationally successful state. No place that is in disagreement on the most inconsistent matters can truly thrive. There needs to be some type of national unity. Now, whether this means nationalism or purely just understanding that to economically survive and progress, we need to get along, that's another argument. But it does need to be acknowledged and needs to be put at the forefront of the conversation if we look to see any if we hope to see any change within the regime and the country's success as a whole. So you've heard of the facts, and now you may be wondering, how does this relate to me? How is this even a problem of international security? Well, I think there are 3 main factors that can be pointed out that can really solidify why this is a problem for the international community and not just something Libya should have to figure out on its own. First, the people. Not only are people being slaughtered and displaced from their homes due to the rebel groups fighting within the country, but we must worry about the refugees and how that will affect the surrounding countries. Tunisia, Chad, everyone around it. It will also be affected by this conflict. This is known as spillover and can also lead to an international security issue when it comes to disease and health and population growth. These are things we need to look out for if we want there to be an international norm established that we do care about how other countries can be affected by different countries' conflicts. 2. Now this speaks more to the political vacuum I was talking about earlier when it comes to who's going to fill it. I'm thinking there is more of a precedent for an international powerhouse to fill this vacuum. Let's say Russia. Being that the United States has kind of backed off after feeling like it didn't set up a proper infrastructure for the post-Gaddafi regime, it causes actors like Russia to want to fill that vacuum. This creates even more of an asymmetrical worldview and will shift and polarize the world even greater than it already has. It is no secret that it's kind of the United States versus Russia versus China, and basically just a battle of these 3 powerhouses to see who can not only gain more political influence, but cultural influence as well as infrastructure. This is very important to the international community because if the world is getting further polarized, then we can only hope to see, well, not hope to see, but only expect to see more conflict, more disagreement, and less cooperation between the international community. And 3. Essentially, Libya is a very good example of when the international community failed. We wanted to take down this political powerhouse, we wanted to end a dictatorship, in terms of the US's motives, but we didn't quite think about what would happen following the fall. This is not the first time this has happened in history. We need to start taking more accountability for the fact that if we're going to go in and essentially establish a maybe not so desired international norm of just taking out regimes when we feel them as unfit, that we need to be willing to clean up the mess after it is made. We need to be able to get government programs, maybe using international actors like the United Nations to send in aid, to send in peacekeepers, to send in infrastructure building. We need to, as an international community, own the mistakes we have made in the past. And this is one of them that we cannot run away from because it is still going on today, more than almost a decade after it happened. Now to the part everyone has been waiting for, the resolution. What are we supposed to do? Well, I don't think this is going to be easy, and I don't think it's going to come in a day because, let's be honest, nothing ever does. But I think there are 4 essential steps in the ways that we can start seeing progress towards Libya and how we can truly start to rebuild this state that has essentially been left a mess. First, calling upon international state actors that are still regionally close in proximity to help and try and rectify the matter. Using examples like Tunisia as ways to show positive things that came from the Arab Spring, Libya can sort of take the lead. This is not saying maybe share regime types, maybe try and use their same way of government, but use them as sort of role models for what is possible. I think this is important because it's one thing from the big W West coming and trying to impose democracy or set their sort of standard and what they think the region should do, as there's always been a divide between the Middle Eastern North African region and the big W West, but having a regional state actor truly act as a pinnacle of what is possible. 2, and this sort of goes along with the first point, truly developing an EU-style union to unite that entire region. Now, yes, Libya, Tunisia, Chad are all part of the African Union, but they are not quite as developed. And clearly aren't as old as the European Union and don't have the same initiatives set in place. There's not as many checks and balances, which essentially leaves it open for the ball to be dropped a lot more. I think if we use the EU and other international organizations that have seen much success throughout their years to sort of model a new union that we can create, it'll really help set up more infrastructure, not only individually as a state, but can help regionally grow and prosper. 3, and to some possibly the most important, the economics. Now, it is no shock that Libya is not in the best financial standing. There are some natural resources that can be accessed. There's an abundance of oil, but I think it is important to not use that as the main focus for how they can build their economy. We already know that there are money-hungry, oil-hungry state actors in this world, and we would not want Libya to be taken advantage of and used as some type of goat for their oil and not actually see any real progress. I think that international, wealth organizations should truly take the lead on funding the rebuilding of the Libyan economy. World Bank, IMF, personal loans depending on who it's coming from and depending on what individual mediations can take place to have a payment or budget set in place could also work. I think that this would come under a lot of advisory from the established EU-style union that would be created. And I also think that that union should be smaller, because the less people to converse with, the less conflicts we come across. I also think that we should not focus on any debts that Libya has. I'm not saying to eradicate them, but I am saying that in order to truly move forward, it also have to let go of some of the baggage from the past. A lot of this probably comes subsequent to them not knowing how to manage their funds and not really having a good, plan of action when it comes to really rebuilding their economy. And last but in no ways least, I think that we need to use the United Nations. Now, I'm not saying the United Nations is the end-all be-all. In many ways, I think they have not truly shown their full potential. But what I do think the United Nations is amazing for is really being used as a stage and a platform for international transparency and communication. I think if we use the UN as a stage to really put the Libyan initiative forward and truly stand in solidarity in helping Libya, that it truly says something about the international community and really puts on a great face. Now, it's not all about looks in this conflict, and it's not all about who's going to make themselves look the best, but we truly want every nation in the world to see that this is a problem that doesn't just regard the United States or Russia or whoever might fill the power vacuum or whoever has the most money or who's funding the most, but is really an international community's duty to protect and help each other thrive. And this is just one of the ways we can do it, and one of the bodies, and truly what the UN was designed for, an international platform for cooperation, organization, and state building. Now, Libya is not a conflict that can be solved in a day, and I'd be surprised if anyone thought so. But I think by taking these first steps as an international community and truly protecting the international security of the world, we can truly start to see improvements. This will also set a precedent and an international norm for learning how to rebuild things that have fallen, not just casting them aside and forgetting. Until next time, this is Rhetta Bates. Good evening.